I have explained this diagram quite a few times, and now we want to extend this scenario by having more detailed environment or environment specific configuration. This is very useful for developing software as a service products or SaaS products, because in SaaS products every customer gets the exact copy of the package, however their configuration is different or their database is different. And we can implement this scenario in Octopus Deploy by something called tenants. As an example, if we want to have multiple clients deployed to our production environment and we give each client a specific configuration and database and logo and things like that, we can use tenants. For example, if we want to have a client called BMW and a client called Audi in our production environments, we will create a tenant for BMW and a tenant for Audi, and then we give a specific values to the variables for BMW and different values for the same variables in Audi. This is even useful for developers, because imagine that some developers want to test their own code in dev environment, but because they may overwrite each other's code, developer 1 can have a tenant for themselves, and then we can have a separate tenant on the dev environment for developer, for example, 2, and then each of those developers can deploy their own code to any of those tenants and test it for themselves. So as you see, tenants are basically an extra layer of environment. And now we go to Octopus Deploy and see how we implement tenants in Octopus Deploy. So in Octopus Deploy, if you look at the menu on the top of the page, there is a tenants menu, and by default there is no tenants. You don't need tenants to deploy products. So normally this feature is overlooked, but it's a very powerful feature. So to create a tenant, we can click on add a tenant and provide a name. For example, we can say this is BMW and click on save. You can keep adding more tenants. For example, we can say I want Audi as well. So every time you create a tenant, you have to connect it to a project and to at least one environment. So if I click on connect project, I can choose a project. By default, tenanted deployments are disabled. So if we choose a project, Octopus Deploy will ask us if we want to enable the tenanted deployments, and we can enable it right away in this page. And then you have to choose at least one environment as well for that tenant and click on add connection. And we can do the same thing for the other tenant, which was Audi. So I can say connect to project and then select the environment. So now we have two tenants that are connected to the same projects. Now if I go to my project, I can define variable templates that will allow me to provide different values for each tenant. In order to do that, you have to click on variables. It gets expanded, and then click on project templates. Project templates are basically variables, however they will be used in tenants. For example, we can create a new template and the variable name can be something like database address, and you can provide optional label and help text if you want. And you can also define the control type, for example, text box, multiple line text box, drop down checkbox, or password box. So I will say this is just a text box, and you don't need to provide default value. You can click on add, and you can keep adding as many variables as you want. And then we click on save. Now that your project has templates, we can go back to the tenants and open each of these tenants, click on variables. And if I expand my project, you will see that I get the list of all the variable templates defined in that project. And now you have to define tenant specific value. For example, I can say database address for Audi is audi.database.local, something like this. It's a made up URL. Click on save. And if I go to the other tenant, I have the same variable and I can provide a different value, for example, bmw.database.local. Now, before we go and create a release and deploy to these tenants, there is one more step that we have to do, and that is assigning our deployment targets to these tenants. So we have to go to infrastructure and find the deployment target or tentacle that we want to deploy to, click on it, and there are two options that we have to set. The first one is that by default, deployment targets are excluded from tenanted deployments, and therefore we have to choose either of the other two options. So either you say that this deployment target will be only part of a tenanted deployment, or will be part of either tenanted or untenanted deployments. So we choose that. Once you enable tenanted deployment, you get a new option, and now you have to associate this deployment target to your tenants and click on save. So tenants will have access to this deployment target. Now I can go to the project, open the project, create a release. When I create a release, I'm going to choose production and click on save. As soon as I save, the development to dev environment starts, because you know that I said development should be automatic, and also it's not tenanted. We only want to do tenanted deployment to production environment. So deployment to dev is happening automatically. Once the deployment to dev is done, I have the option to deploy to production. And as you see, when I clicked on the deploy to production button in the deploy release page, I have an extra option, which is tenants. And I can choose tenants that I want to deploy to. You don't need to deploy only one. You can deploy as many tenants as you want. Selecting multiple tenants enables you to roll out a bug fix or a feature across all clients. And I can click on deploy. And as you see, now I have two deployments. That shows me that Octopus Deploy creates one deployment per tenant. So the Octopus Deploy created two tenants and it's deploying to two tenants at the same time, and each tenant has its own tasks running. So as you see, tenants gives you more flexibility for deploying the same package for multiple clients or multiple developers, and just change the variable values per tenant.